There's this moment that happens to millions of people every single day, and it goes something like this. The phone starts ringing, the screen lights up with someone's name, and instead of simply answering like a normal human being, there's this immediate internal reaction, almost like a small wave of dread that washes over the entire body. The heart beats a little faster, the shoulders tense up slightly, and there's this overwhelming desire to just watch the phone ring until it stops, to let it go to voicemail, and then maybe send a text message a few minutes later saying something like, "Hey, sorry I missed your call, what's up?" Even though the phone was literally right there the whole time, fully within reach, completely available to be answered. And here's the thing that makes this so interesting. This reaction usually has nothing to do with disliking the person who's calling. And it's not about being too busy to talk. It's something deeper than that. Something that feels almost physical, like the very idea of having a phone conversation creates this unexplainable resistance that's hard to put into words. For a long time, people who experience this have wondered if something is wrong with them, if they're being rude or antisocial or just weirdly avoidant. But the truth is actually much more fascinating and much more validating than that. The psychology of hating phone calls reveals something profound about how different brains process communication. And it turns out that this experience is not only completely normal, but also increasingly common in the modern world. Research shows that over 75% of millennials report experiencing anxiety when their phone rings unexpectedly. And one particularly striking study found that most young adults would literally rather visit the dentist than answer an unexpected phone call, which really says something about how intense this discomfort can be. So what exactly is happening in the brain when a phone rings and that wave of dread kicks in? The first piece of this puzzle is something psychologists call social anxiety. With reduced cues, and understanding this concept changes everything about how we think about phone communication. When people talk to each other face to face, the brain receives an enormous amount of information simultaneously. Facial expressions, body language, eye contact, gestures, posture, micro expressions that flash across the face in milliseconds. All of these signals help the brain navigate the conversation smoothly, providing constant feedback about how the interaction is going, whether the other person is engaged or bored, happy or annoyed, ready to wrap up or wanting to continue. But phone calls strip away almost all of that information, leaving only the voice, and often that voice is slightly distorted, sometimes delayed, occasionally cutting in and out due to connection issues. The brain is essentially trying to navigate a complex social interaction with maybe 20% of the information it normally relies on. And for people whose nervous systems are particularly attuned to social cues, this creates a genuinely stressful experience. It's a bit like trying to drive through an unfamiliar city at night with the headlights dimmed. Technically possible, but requiring so much extra concentration and effort that it becomes exhausting. There's another layer to this that makes phone calls particularly challenging for certain types of people, and it has to do with something called synchronous communication. Most communication in the modern world has become asynchronous, meaning there is a gap between when a message is received and when a response is expected. Texting, email, social media comments, voice messages, all of this allow time to think, to craft a response, to edit and revise before hitting send. This type of communication gives people control over the timing and the content of their responses. And for those who like to process their thoughts before speaking, it feels natural and comfortable. Phone calls destroy that buffer completely, demanding immediate, real-time responses with no opportunity to pause and think, no chance to revise what's being said, no safety net of being able to delete and start over. When someone calls, they're essentially saying, I need your full attention right now, and I need you to respond to me instantly, without preparation, without editing, without the luxury of choosing your words carefully. For people who value precision in communication, who want to say exactly the right thing, who feel more comfortable with time to formulate their thoughts, this real-time demand can feel overwhelming. And then there's the neurological response that happens before any conscious thought even takes place, because the brain's alarm system doesn't distinguish between different types of unexpected interruptions. When a phone rings suddenly, the amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing potential threats, activates almost instantly, releasing a small burst of stress hormones and triggering what researchers call a startle response. The heart rate increases, the muscles tense slightly, the body prepares for something that might require action. For most people, this response fades quickly once they see who's calling and realize there's no actual danger. But for those with heightened anxiety sensitivity, that initial spike doesn't settle down as easily. The startle becomes sustained stress, the ringing itself becomes associated with discomfort, and over time the brain learns to anticipate the stress response, which means the anxiety starts building before the phone even rings. This is classical conditioning at work. The phone becomes a conditioned stimulus for anxiety. And every time someone avoids a call and feels that wave of relief, the conditioning gets stronger, making the next call feel even more threatening. There's also something important to understand about the performance aspect of phone conversations, because unlike texting where messages can be carefully crafted, a phone call is essentially live performance without a script. There is pressure to manage the conversation in real time, to fill awkward silences, to respond appropriately to things that might be hard to hear clearly, to sound interested and engaged, to know when to speak and when to listen, to figure out how to end the call gracefully without being rude. All of this happens while processing audio that's often unclear and without any visual feedback to help guide the interaction. For people who experience what psychologists call evaluation apprehension, which is essentially the fear of being judged negatively by others, phone calls feel like a high-stakes performance where the risk of failure is constant. What if the wrong thing comes out? What if there's a long, awkward silence and it's unclear how to fill it? What if something gets misheard and the response doesn't make sense? These worries might seem irrational from the outside, but they're the natural result of high-stakes social interaction with reduced information and no safety net. One thing that deserves attention here is the common misconception that avoiding phone calls is somehow rude or lazy or a sign of poor social skills, because this misunderstanding causes real harm to people who already feel bad about their phone aversion. The reality is that hating phone calls often correlates with some genuinely positive traits: high sensitivity, deep thinking, conscientiousness, a strong desire to communicate clearly and meaningfully. People who avoid calls frequently care deeply about communication. They want to say the right thing. They want to be understood correctly. They don't want to waste anyone's time or create confusion. The irony is that their discomfort with phone calls often comes from caring too much about communication quality, not too little. Introversion plays a significant role in this as well, because introverted brains process stimulation differently than extroverted ones. Research shows that introverts are more sensitive to external input and require more recovery time after social interactions. And even though phone calls aren't face-to-face, there are still intensely social experiences that require full attention, immediate response, and sustained engagement. For an introverted nervous system, even a short phone call can be draining in a way that an hour of text-based conversation simply isn't. There's also a generational and cultural dimension to consider, because people who grew up with texting as their primary form of communication developed fundamentally different social skills than those who grew up making phone calls regularly. Learning to communicate through text means learning to express thoughts through carefully chosen written words, through emojis that convey tone, through messages that can be revised before sending. Phone calls use an entirely different communication system, one that can feel foreign and uncomfortable if it wasn't practiced extensively during formative years. This isn't a failure or a deficiency, it's simply an adaptation to the communication environment that existed during development. The question of what to do about phone anxiety is one that many people struggle with, and the first and most important step is to stop treating this as a character flaw that needs to be fixed. The nervous system processes phone communication as stressful for legitimate neurological reasons, and understanding those reasons is more helpful than forcing uncomfortable exposure. Setting boundaries around phone communication is completely valid. In most situations, a text or email works just as well as a call, and most people will respect a preference for written communication once it's expressed clearly. For situations where phone calls are unavoidable, preparation can make an enormous difference in reducing anxiety. Writing down key points before dialing, having an opening line and closing line ready to go, knowing exactly what needs to be communicated. All of this reduces the cognitive load and makes the conversation feel more manageable. And afterward, practicing self-compassion rather than self-criticism is essential, because getting through a difficult phone call is an accomplishment for someone whose brain processes calls as threatening. What emerges from all of this research and reflection is a really important reframe of what it means to hate phone calls. It's not a character flaw or a social deficiency or a sign of rudeness. It's a mismatch between a communication technology and a particular type of nervous system. Phones were invented in an era before anyone understood neurodiversity, before alternatives existed, before there was any awareness that one-size-fits-all communication doesn't work for everyone. Preferring text over calls isn't being difficult. Letting calls go to voicemail isn't being antisocial. Asking people to message instead of calling isn't being rude. These are all ways of honoring how a particular brain works and choosing communication methods that allow for showing up as the best version of oneself. In a world that constantly demands immediate attention and instant availability, there's actually something valuable about people who communicate thoughtfully and deliberately, who take time to craft meaningful responses, who refuse to be rushed into saying things they haven't had time to consider. The next time a phone rings and that familiar wave of dread appears, it might help to remember that this response makes sense, that it's rooted in real neurology, that millions of other people experience exactly the same thing. That ringing phone isn't a test of character or social competence. It's just one communication method among many, and it's okay for it not to be the preferred one. The comments would love to hear from others who share this experience. How long does the phone typically ring before going to voicemail? What's the go-to excuse for missed calls? These conversations help build understanding and remind everyone that they're not alone in this. More psychology content like this is coming soon, exploring all the parts of human behavior that don't always get talked about. And in the meantime, there is no need to feel guilty about that missed call. They can always send a text.